The robotics team laughed when I joined, having no clue I was an engineer who'd built military drones. The team captain held up my application form like it was contaminated and read my name out loud to the entire workshop. Eli Casper, transfer student, no prior robotics experience. He paused for effect while the 12 other students snickered. Says here he's interested in learning the basics. The captain's name was Jordan Whitmore, a senior with perfectly styled hair and a varsity jacket he wore even indoors, and he looked at me like I'd just asked to borrow his car. I stood in the doorway of Kennedy High's robotics lab on a Wednesday afternoon in October, holding a backpack that contained more technical knowledge than everyone in that room combined, and I said nothing while they enjoyed their moment. Jordan tossed my application onto a workbench covered in circuit boards and aluminum parts. He asked if I even knew what an Arduino was, and when I said I'd heard of them, the girl next to him actually laughed out loud. Her name was Skylar Chen, though everyone called her Sky, and she was Jordan's girlfriend and the team's lead programmer. She said they weren't a beginner's club, that Kennedy Robotics was ranked 3rd in the state and heading to nationals, and maybe I should try the computer club instead where they taught coding to freshmen. I'd been living in suburban Oregon for exactly 43 days after spending 6 years designing autonomous weapons systems for Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works division in California. My security clearance had been revoked, my marriage had ended, and my name had been added to a congressional investigation into unauthorized drone deployments that killed civilians in 3 countries. The details were classified, but the scandal wasn't, and moving to a small town under my mother's maiden name was the only way to avoid the reporters and investigators who'd made my previous life impossible. My real name was Eli Bergman, and I'd led a team of 47 engineers building AI targeting systems that could identify threats at 3,000 feet and eliminate them with 98% accuracy. I was 31 years old, looked young enough to pass for 23, and had enrolled in community college classes while living with my aunt to maintain the illusion that I was just another student trying to figure out my future. Nobody at Kennedy High knew any of this, and I intended to keep it that way. The robotics club met 3 times a week, and I needed something normal in my life, something that reminded me why I'd loved engineering before it became about body counts and congressional hearings. Jordan said I could stay and observe if I kept quiet and didn't touch anything expensive. He pointed to a metal folding chair near the back wall where someone had taped a poster of Iron Man with the caption, "This could be you," written in marker. I sat down and pulled out a notebook while watching them work on their competition robot, a mechanical arm mounted on a wheeled base designed to pick up colored blocks and sort them into bins. The design was competent but inefficient, using servos where stepper motors would provide better precision and a control system that relied on pre-programmed sequences instead of real-time sensor feedback. They were building a glorified toy when they could have built something actually intelligent. A junior named Marcus Webb was soldering connections on a circuit board, holding the iron at the wrong angle and creating cold joints that would fail under vibration. Another student named Priya Anand was programming movement sequences on a laptop, writing code that was functional but inelegant, full of nested if statements when a state machine would have been cleaner. Jordan moved between stations offering advice that was mostly textbook theory he'd memorized without understanding the underlying engineering principles. The team's faculty advisor was Mr. Thornton, a math teacher in his 50s, who clearly knew more about geometry than robotics. He wandered through the lab checking on students, but didn't offer any technical guidance, just encouragement about working hard and meeting deadlines. The regional competition was in 5 weeks, and Jordan kept announcing that this was Kennedy's year to finally beat Lincoln Prep, their rival school that had won the state championship 3 years running. Everyone nodded with the kind of forced enthusiasm that suggested they didn't actually believe they could win, but wanted to support team morale. I watched their robot attempt a practice run and counted 7 points where the design would fail under competition stress. The arm's range of motion was limited by poor joint placement. The wheelbase was too narrow for the weight distribution. The sensor array couldn't distinguish between similar colored objects under varying lighting conditions. The battery placement would shift the center of gravity during operation. I wrote down each issue in my notebook and said nothing. After the meeting ended, Sky noticed me still sitting there and asked if I'd understood anything I'd watched. I said it looked like they were making good progress, and she exchanged a look with Jordan that clearly meant they thought I was clueless. Jordan told me that if I wanted to join officially, I'd need to pay the $50 club fee and pass a basic skills assessment to prove I wouldn't slow them down. He said they'd test me next week on circuit assembly, basic programming, and mechanical design principles. I said I'd be ready and left before anyone could ask more questions about my background or why a community college student was interested in a high school robotics club. My aunt picked me up in her Subaru Outback and asked how it went. I said fine, and she caught the tone in my voice that meant it definitely wasn't fine. She knew about my situation, about the congressional investigation and the classified drone program and the reason I was living under an assumed name. She'd agreed to help me disappear for a few months while lawyers sorted through whether I'd be charged with anything criminal or just lose my career and reputation. That evening, I set up my laptop in the small bedroom my aunt had given me and reviewed files from my previous work. Technical specifications for the MQ-9 Reaper drone, navigation algorithms for autonomous flight systems, targeting protocols that could process satellite imagery in real time. Everything was classified, and I technically shouldn't have copies. But when your security clearance gets revoked, you make backups because you know they're going to erase you from every project you built. I'd spent 6 years of my life designing systems that were supposed to protect American soldiers by taking human operators out of dangerous situations. The technology worked perfectly. The problem was that perfect technology in imperfect hands made mistakes that killed wedding parties and school buses and aid workers. 3 congressional committees were now investigating whether our targeting algorithms had been deployed prematurely, whether we'd known about the civilian casualties, whether anyone should face criminal charges for prioritizing military contracts over human lives. I thought about those high school kids struggling with their simple robot, and felt something like nostalgia for when engineering was about solving problems instead of creating them. And I'd joined the robotics club because I needed a reminder that technology could be innocent, that building things could be about creativity and competition instead of classified briefings and kill ratios. But watching them mock me for being a beginner made me realize that innocence was already gone, that even in a high school workshop, people judged your worth based on credentials and performance. I went back the next week with my $50 and submitted to Jordan's skills assessment. He gave me a circuit board kit and asked me to assemble a basic LED array with push-button controls. I completed it in 12 minutes, deliberately making it look like I was struggling with a few connections to avoid seeming too competent. Jordan tested it and seemed disappointed that everything worked correctly. Sky gave me a programming challenge, asking me to write code that would make a servo motor rotate to specific angles based on button inputs. I wrote it in Python using Arduino libraries, keeping the code simple and well-commented so it looked like something a beginner might produce after reading a tutorial. The code executed perfectly, and Sky frowned like she'd hoped I would fail. The mechanical design test involved sketching a simple gripper mechanism that could pick up objects of varying sizes. I drew something conventional using parallel jaw design with spring-loaded fingers, nothing innovative but competent enough to pass their test. Jordan reviewed all 3 assessments and reluctantly admitted I'd passed, though he added that passing the minimum requirements didn't mean I was ready for actual competition work. He assigned me to maintenance duties, saying I could help organize parts, clean workbenches, and maybe assist with basic assembly tasks if I proved reliable. It was obvious he wanted me in a subordinate role where I wouldn't threaten his position as team leader. I accepted the assignment without complaint and spent the next 2 weeks organizing screws, labeling bins, and watching them make the same mistakes repeatedly on their competition robot. 3 weeks before regionals, their robot failed a critical test run. The arm mechanism jammed during block pickup, the wheels locked up randomly, and the control system crashed twice in 5 minutes. Jordan called an emergency meeting and announced they needed to troubleshoot everything this weekend or risk showing up to competition with a non-functional robot. Mr. Thornton looked worried and suggested maybe they should simplify the design, but Jordan insisted they could fix it with more testing and calibration. I watched from my usual spot near the back and counted at least 9 fundamental problems that testing wouldn't solve. The servo motor in the arm was underpowered for the weight it was lifting. The wheel encoders were giving false readings because of electrical interference from the control board. The programming logic had race conditions that caused random crashes. They spent 6 hours that Saturday trying different fixes, and by evening, the robot was performing worse than when they started. Marcus threw a screwdriver across the room in frustration and said they were going to embarrass themselves at regionals. Sky was near tears, staring at her laptop screen where error messages kept appearing. Jordan's confident demeanor had cracked, and he looked lost, like a kid who'd suddenly realized he didn't know what he was doing. Mr. Thornton suggested they take a break and come back with fresh perspectives on Monday. Everyone packed up their things in defeated silence. I was putting tools away when Sky approached me and asked if I'd noticed anything specific that might be causing the problems. Her tone wasn't condescending anymore, just desperate. I said I'd observed a few potential issues and could show her if she wanted. She called Jordan over and he came reluctantly, clearly not wanting to admit he needed help from the new kid who'd barely passed the skills assessment. I walked them through the problems I'd identified, explaining each issue in language they could understand without revealing the depth of my expertise. I suggested they replace the servo with a higher torque model, shield the encoder cables to prevent interference, and restructure the control loop to handle multiple sensor inputs simultaneously. Jordan asked how I knew so much about this stuff if I was supposedly a beginner. I said I'd been reading a lot of online tutorials and watching YouTube videos, which was technically true even if it understated 6 years of professional engineering experience. Sky pulled up component specifications on her laptop and confirmed that my suggestions were technically sound. Jordan looked uncomfortable, like he was weighing whether accepting help from me would undermine his authority or whether losing at regionals would be worse for his ego. He finally agreed to try my recommendations, framing it as incorporating team member feedback into our iterative design process, so it sounded like collaborative leadership instead of taking advice from someone he'd dismissed as incompetent. We spent the next week implementing changes, and I was careful to let other team members do the actual work while I just offered guidance. Marcus did the soldering with me, pointing out the correct technique. Priya rewrote the control code with me, suggesting structure but letting her write the syntax. Sky redesigned the sensor array with me, sketching ideas she could refine. Jordan supervised everything, taking credit for the improvements in his status updates to Mr. Thornton. The robot's performance improved dramatically, and by the time we reached regionals, It was operating at about 70% of what it could be if I designed it from scratch, but good enough to be competitive. The regional competition happened at Portland State University in early November. 23 schools competed across 2 days, with robots performing timed challenges involving block sorting, obstacle navigation, and precision placement tasks. Kennedy's team arrived early and set up in the practice area where other schools were testing their robots. I noticed Lincoln Prep's team immediately because their robot was significantly more advanced than anything else in the competition. They had custom machined aluminum components, professional-grade sensors, and movement that was smooth and precise. Their team captain was a girl named Isabella Torres, who carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew she was operating at a different level than her competitors. Jordan saw Lincoln Prep's robot and his face went pale. He muttered that they must have outside help, that no high school team could build something that sophisticated without professionals involved. The first day of competition went well for Kennedy. Our robot completed the block sorting challenge with only minor errors, scoring enough points to place 5th overall after the first round. Jordan was ecstatic, already talking about how we might place in top 3 and qualify for state finals. Sky's programming worked reliably despite the pressure, and Marcus's assembly held together under competition stress. I watched from the team pit area, helping with minor repairs between rounds but staying in the background while Jordan gave interviews to parents and younger students who wanted to know how Kennedy had improved so dramatically this year. During the second round, Lincoln Prep posted a near-perfect score, their robot executing every task flawlessly while the crowd applauded. Isabella Torres stood at the control station with her team, and I could see they were operating on a completely different level than everyone else. Their programming included machine learning algorithms that adapted to the competition environment in real time. Their mechanical design used principles I'd implemented in military drone navigation systems. Someone on that team had expertise far beyond high school robotics. Between rounds, I walked past Lincoln Prep's pit area and glanced at their robot. The construction quality was exceptional, and I noticed design elements that were definitely professional work. The sensor fusion system used Kalman filtering for position tracking. The motor controllers had custom firmware that optimized power delivery. The frame design incorporated finite element analysis to minimize weight while maximizing structural integrity. I took a few photos on my phone, telling myself I was just curious, but already forming questions about who had really built this machine. Isabella noticed me looking and asked if I had questions about their design. I said I was impressed by the engineering quality, and she smiled and said they had a great team this year. Something in her tone suggested she knew exactly how good their robot was, and wasn't worried about any competition. Kennedy finished the day in 4th place overall, just barely qualifying for the final round on Sunday. Jordan gathered the team that evening at a restaurant near the hotel where we were staying, and gave a speech about how proud he was of everyone's effort. He thanked specific team members by name for their contributions, and when he got to me, he paused and said, "And Eli has been helpful with maintenance and support tasks." The dismissive phrasing stung more than I expected, but I smiled and accepted the minimal acknowledgement. Sky looked uncomfortable with how Jordan had described my contribution, but she didn't correct him. That night I couldn't sleep, thinking about Lincoln Prep's robot and about my own situation. I'd spent 6 years building weapons that killed people, and now I was hiding in a high school robotics club pretending to be someone I wasn't. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was suspicious of Lincoln Prep for possibly having outside help when I was the ultimate outside help for Kennedy, bringing expertise that had no business being in a high school competition. Sunday morning brought the final round, where the top 8 teams competed in an elimination tournament. Kennedy drew Lincoln Prep in the first match, and Jordan's excitement evaporated when he saw the pairing. Our robot would compete directly against theirs in a head-to-head challenge where both machines worked simultaneously to sort blocks, with the highest score advancing. The match started, and within 30 seconds it was clear we had no chance. Lincoln Prep's robot moved with mechanical precision that our design couldn't match, sorting blocks at twice our speed while our arms struggled with pickup reliability. We scored 42 points while they scored 97, an absolutely crushing defeat that ended our tournament. Jordan stood at the control station looking devastated, and Sky had tears running down her face. Marcus kicked a chair and walked away. The rest of the team just stared at the scoreboard, showing how badly we'd been beaten. I watched Lincoln Prep celebrate their victory and advance to the next round, and something bothered me about how perfect their performance had been. Perfect in competition is actually suspicious because real engineering always has compromises and failure points. But their robot had executed flawlessly across 2 days, never making errors, never showing the kind of random failures that happen when complex systems operate under stress. After the award ceremony where Lincoln Prep took first place and qualified for nationals, I approached Isabella Torres and congratulated her on the win. I mentioned that their robot's performance had been remarkably consistent and asked about their design process. She said they'd worked hard all season and had a great advisor who helped them understand advanced concepts. I asked who their advisor was, and she hesitated before saying he was a private engineering consultant her parents had hired to mentor the team. That evening, after Kennedy's team had packed up and headed home in disappointed silence, I did some research on my laptop in my aunt's living room. I searched for Lincoln Prep's robotics team history and found they'd been mediocre for years before suddenly becoming dominant this season. I found Isabella Torres's social media and scrolled through photos of their robot being built. In the background of one photo, I noticed a man in his 40s wearing a Lockheed Martin polo shirt. I zoomed in on the image and my stomach dropped. The man was Derek Paulson, a senior systems engineer I'd worked with in California. Derek had been part of the drone navigation team, specializing in autonomous pathfinding algorithms. I pulled up professional networking sites and confirmed Derek had left Lockheed Martin 8 months ago and moved to Portland to work as an independent contractor. The timeline matched perfectly with Lincoln Prep's sudden improvement in robotics competition. I sat there staring at my screen, processing what this meant. Derek was using classified military technology to help high school students win robotics competitions. The algorithms in Lincoln Prep's robot weren't just advanced. They were derived from systems designed for military drones worth $30 million each. He'd taken proprietary technology and repurposed it for a high school competition, which was probably multiple federal crimes involving intellectual property theft and misuse of classified information. But exposing this would require explaining how I recognized the technology, which meant revealing my own background and potentially drawing attention to my situation with the Congressional investigation. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark living room, weighing whether I should report what I'd found or just let it go. Kennedy had already been eliminated from competition, so Lincoln Prep's cheating didn't affect us anymore. But it bothered me on a fundamental level that Derek was teaching kids to win through theft and deception instead of actual learning and innovation. The next day at school, I mentioned to Sky that I'd noticed some interesting design elements in Lincoln Prep's robot that seemed unusually sophisticated. She said everyone knew Lincoln Prep had professional help, but there was no rule against advisors with engineering backgrounds helping students. I said there was a difference between teaching concepts and directly building the robot for them, and she admitted the line was blurry, but nobody had proven Lincoln Prep crossed it. I suggested someone should investigate whether their advisor was using proprietary technology he wasn't authorized to share, and Sky gave me a strange look and asked how I would even know about something like that. I said just hypothetically, if someone was using corporate or military technology in a high school competition, that would be serious misconduct. Sky said that sounded paranoid, and maybe I should focus on helping Kennedy improve for next season instead of making accusations about competitors. I dropped the subject but couldn't stop thinking about it. And that weekend, I visited Portland State University's engineering library and researched competition rules for high school robotics. The regulations were clear about student work versus adult contribution, requiring that students design and build at least 70% of the robot with advisors providing guidance rather than direct implementation. More importantly, all technology used in competition had to be legally obtained and properly licensed, with teams required to disclose any commercial components or software that required special permissions. If Lincoln Prep was using algorithms derived from classified military systems, they were violating multiple rules and potentially federal laws regarding technology transfer. I drafted an anonymous complaint to the competition's organizing committee, outlining my concerns about Lincoln Prep's robot and suggesting they investigate the team's advisor and technology sources. Before submitting the complaint, I called my lawyer in California, a woman named Andrea Briggs who'd been helping me navigate the Congressional investigation. I explained the situation without initially revealing my involvement, framing it as something I'd observed at a competition. She asked pointed questions about how I knew the technology was military-derived, and I admitted I'd recognized design patterns from my previous work. Andrea was quiet for a long moment before saying this was complicated because exposing Derek's misconduct would require me to testify about my own expertise, which would destroy my anonymity and potentially compromise my legal situation. She said the Congressional investigation was still active, and investigators were looking for any evidence that engineers had misused classified information. If I came forward about Derek, they'd also scrutinize how I recognized the technology and whether I had misused information myself. She strongly advised against filing any complaint, saying my priority needed to be protecting myself rather than policing a high school robotics competition. I thanked Andrea and ended the call, but her advice didn't sit right with me. I'd spent the past 6 months feeling guilty about the drone program and the civilians who died because of technology I helped create. Here was a chance to do something right, to prevent that same technology from being exploited for something as meaningless as high school competition wins. But doing the right thing would cost me everything I'd been trying to protect: my anonymity, my safety, my chance at rebuilding a normal life. I sat with this dilemma for 3 days, barely sleeping, playing out scenarios in my head. Finally, I decided that hiding from consequences hadn't made me feel any better, and maybe facing them would. I revised my complaint to the competition committee, this time including my real name and credentials. I explained that I was a former Lockheed Martin engineer with expertise in autonomous systems, that I'd recognized proprietary technology in Lincoln Prep's robot, and that I was willing to provide technical testimony about how I knew the algorithms were derived from classified military systems. I sent the complaint on a Wednesday evening in late November. By Friday morning, I received a phone call from the competition's ethics director, a retired engineer named Graham Foster who'd worked in aerospace for 30 years. He asked detailed questions about my background and how I'd identified the technology in Lincoln Prep's robot. I walked him through the specific design elements, explaining which aspects matched known military systems and why no high school team would independently develop those same solutions. Graham said he took these allegations seriously, but needed to verify my credentials before proceeding. I gave him Andrea Briggs's contact information and permission to confirm my employment history at Lockheed Martin. He said he'd call me back within a week after investigating the claims. That same afternoon, I got a call from Andrea, and she was furious. She said I'd potentially compromised my legal protection by going public about my expertise, and that congressional investigators had already contacted her asking about my involvement in the robotics competition. She said they were now questioning whether I'd shared classified information with the high school team, which could be construed as the exact kind of misconduct they were investigating. I explained that I hadn't shared anything, that I'd only recognized someone else's misconduct, but she said the distinction might not matter in a congressional hearing. The situation escalated quickly. By Monday, I received a formal letter from the Congressional Committee investigating the drone program, requesting my testimony at a hearing scheduled for 3 weeks later. The letter mentioned my participation in a civilian robotics competition and asked specific questions about whether I'd utilized classified knowledge in that context. I called Andrea in a panic, and she said this was exactly what she'd warned me about, that trying to expose Derek had drawn attention to myself. She said the committee was now investigating whether I'd violated non-disclosure agreements by applying military expertise to civilian projects, even if I'd only done so to identify someone else's violations. The legal logic was Byzantine, but the threat was real. I could face charges for misusing classified information, lose any chance of working in engineering again, and potentially face criminal prosecution. Andrea said our best option was to argue that I'd only recognized Derek's work because of my legitimate expertise, and that identifying violations wasn't the same as committing them. But she warned that congressional hearings weren't about truth. They were about political theater and finding scapegoats. At Kennedy High, word had spread that I was involved in some kind of scandal involving the robotics competition. Jordan confronted me in the lab on a Monday afternoon, demanding to know what I'd done. I explained that I'd filed a complaint about Lincoln Prep using unauthorized technology, and he looked at me like I'd betrayed the entire school. He said Lincoln Prep's problems had nothing to do with Kennedy, and I'd probably made our school look bad by association. Sky was more sympathetic, asking if I was okay and whether I needed help dealing with whatever was happening. I told her I'd recognized something wrong and reported it, and now I was facing consequences for speaking up. She said that seemed unfair, and I agreed, but also acknowledged I'd known the risks when I filed the complaint. Marcus asked if this meant Kennedy would move up in the rankings if Lincoln Prep was disqualified, and Jordan told him to shut up. That wasn't the point. Mr. Thornton called me into his classroom after school and asked if I wanted to talk about what was happening. I gave him a sanitized version, explaining that I had an engineering background more extensive than I'd initially disclosed, and that I'd identified possible rule violations at the competition. He asked why I hadn't mentioned my background when joining the team, and I said I'd wanted to avoid attention and just participate in something normal. He said he understood the desire for privacy, but that hiding expertise from the team had created an awkward situation where I'd been underestimated and marginalized. He asked if I'd actually helped design Kennedy's robot, and I admitted I'd provided guidance but let the students do the work. He said that was appropriate, but in the future I should be honest about my qualifications so people could benefit from my knowledge rather than discovering it in crisis moments. Graham Foster called me back 2 weeks before the congressional hearing. He said his investigation had confirmed that Lincoln Prep's advisor, Derek Paulson, had indeed used proprietary technology from his previous employer in designing the team's robot. The competition committee was disqualifying Lincoln Prep from this season's results and referring Derek to federal authorities for potential prosecution regarding intellectual property theft and technology transfer violations. Graham thanked me for bringing this to their attention and said my technical analysis had been crucial in identifying the violations. He also mentioned that the investigation had revealed Lincoln Prep had won several competitions over the past year using the same compromised technology, and those results were all being overturned. I asked what this meant for me, and Graham said I'd probably need to testify if Derek faced criminal charges, but that my role as a whistleblower should protect me from any liability. I said I had other legal complications and might not be available to testify, and he said he understood but hoped I'd cooperate if called upon. The news about Lincoln Prep broke publicly 3 days later when the competition committee issued a statement announcing the disqualification and ongoing federal investigation. Local media picked up the story, running headlines about high school robotics scandal and military technology misused in student competition. Isabella Torres gave an interview saying the team had trusted their advisor and didn't know he was using unauthorized technology. Derek Paulson's name was mentioned along with his previous employment at Lockheed Martin, and suddenly reporters were connecting dots to the congressional investigation into the drone program. One journalist found my complaint to the competition committee and published my name as the engineer who'd exposed the scandal. By that evening, my phone was flooded with calls from reporters asking about my involvement in both the robotics scandal and the larger drone program investigation. I stopped answering calls and texts from anyone I didn't recognize, but the damage was done. My anonymity was completely destroyed. Andrea called and said the congressional hearing had been moved up to next week, and that the committee wanted to question me about both the drone program and the robotics competition. She said they were trying to establish whether I'd violated my non-disclosure agreement by using classified knowledge to identify Derek's work, which was legally absurd but politically convenient. The committee wanted a scapegoat for the drone program's failures, and a former engineer who was involved in a public scandal made an attractive target. She'd scheduled a meeting with the committee's chief counsel to negotiate my testimony and try to limit the scope of questions, but she warned that I should prepare for a hostile environment. The hearing would be public, televised, and designed to make me look either incompetent for not preventing civilian casualties or criminal for misusing classified information. Neither narrative was accurate, but accuracy wasn't the committee's priority. I spent the next week preparing testimony with Andrea. We drafted statements explaining my role in the drone program, my recognition of similar technology at the robotics competition, and my decision to report Derek's violations despite the personal cost. We practiced questions the committee might ask and how to answer without revealing classified information while still explaining my expertise. The key message was that I'd identified misconduct and reported it appropriately, that I'd never shared classified information with students, and that my involvement in the robotics club had been about finding normalcy after a traumatic professional situation. Andrea said the truth was on my side, but congressional hearings weren't about truth. They were about performance. I needed to stay calm, answer questions precisely, and not let hostile committee members provoke me into emotional responses that would make good television clips. The hearing took place in Washington, D.C. on a freezing morning in early December. The committee room was packed with reporters, congressional staffers, and members of the public who'd followed the drone program scandal. I sat at a table facing 9 committee members, my hands shaking as I raised my right hand to swear the oath. The chairman opened with a statement about the committee's mission to investigate misuse of military technology and ensure accountability for decisions that cost civilian lives. He mentioned my role in designing drone targeting systems and my recent involvement in exposing misconduct at a high school robotics competition. He said the committee had questions about both situations and expected my full cooperation. The first hour of questioning focused on the drone program itself, with committee members asking technical questions about how the targeting algorithms worked and who had authorized their deployment. I answered carefully, explaining the technology in general terms without revealing classified specifications. Several members were hostile, implying I'd known about the civilian casualties and continued working on the program anyway. I said I'd raised concerns with supervisors about deployment readiness and had been assured proper protocols would be followed. The questioning shifted to the robotics competition around 11 a.m. when a congressman from Oregon asked how I'd become involved with Kennedy High's team. I explained that I'd moved to Oregon for personal reasons and joined the robotics club as a volunteer. He asked why I hadn't disclosed my professional background to the school, and I said I'd wanted privacy while dealing with the congressional investigation. He suggested I'd hidden my identity because I knew I'd done something wrong with the drone program and was trying to escape accountability. I said that wasn't accurate, that I'd simply needed time to process what happened and figure out my next steps. Another committee member asked how I'd recognized military technology in a high school robot, and I explained the specific design elements that matched proprietary systems. She asked if I'd shared any of those systems with Kennedy's team, and I said no, I'd only recognized them in a competitor's robot. She implied I must have violated my non-disclosure agreement to have such detailed knowledge, and I said recognizing technology wasn't the same as sharing it. The most hostile questioning came from a senator who'd made her reputation attacking defense contractors for cost overruns and misconduct. She asked whether I felt any responsibility for the civilians killed by drones I'd helped design. I said I felt tremendous responsibility, and that was partly why I'd come forward about Derek's violations, because I didn't want military technology being misused in any context. She said that seemed convenient, that I was trying to rehabilitate my image by playing Whistleblower in a trivial high school scandal while people were dead because of my work. I said both things could be true, that I could regret my role in the drone program and still think exposing Derek's misconduct was the right thing to do. She said I'd destroyed my anonymity and compromised my legal position just to win points at a high school competition, which showed the same poor judgment I'd demonstrated at Lockheed Martin. Andrea tried to object, but the chairman said the committee had wide latitude in questioning witnesses. I sat there while the senator continued attacking my character, my judgment, and my motives, turning my testimony into a public humiliation. The hearing lasted 6 hours total, with breaks for lunch and committee deliberations. By the end, I was exhausted and emotionally drained, having answered hundreds of questions while being accused of everything from incompetence to criminal conspiracy. The final questioning came from a congressman who asked what I'd learned from this experience. I said I'd learned that doing the right thing often costs more than you expect, but that hiding from problems doesn't make them go away. I said I wished I'd spoken up earlier about concerns with the drone program, and that exposing Derek's misconduct at the robotics competition was partly about trying to do better this time. I said I understood people were angry about civilian casualties and that I'd probably never work in defense engineering again, but I hoped some good could come from these investigations if they led to better oversight and accountability. The congressman thanked me for my testimony and said the committee would include my statements in their final report. The hearing concluded, and Andrea rushed me out of the building through a back entrance to avoid the reporters waiting outside. On the flight back to Oregon, Andrea reviewed how the hearing had gone. She said I'd handled the hostile questions reasonably well and hadn't revealed classified information or said anything that would directly support criminal charges. But she warned that the committee's report would probably blame engineers like me for the drone program's failures and that I should prepare for public criticism when the report was released in a few months. She said my decision to expose Derek had been vindicated by the investigation's findings, but that vindication wouldn't undo the personal costs. I asked if I'd face criminal charges, and she said it was unlikely given that I'd cooperated fully and hadn't actually misused classified information. But my career in defense engineering was definitely over, and I'd need to figure out what came next. I spent the flight staring out the window at clouds, thinking about how I'd gone from designing cutting-edge weapons systems to testifying before Congress about a high school robotics scandal and wondering if any of it had been worth it. Back at Kennedy High, the mood was strange. The news had covered my congressional testimony, and now everyone knew I was a former military engineer who'd worked on controversial drone systems. Some students thought I was a whistleblower hero, others thought I was a war criminal hiding in their school. Jordan avoided me completely, clearly uncomfortable with the revelation that the beginner he'd dismissed was actually more qualified than anyone in the school. Sky approached me in the robotics lab and said she'd watched some of the hearing testimony online and thought the committee had treated me unfairly. She asked if I'd actually helped design Kennedy's robot more than I'd admitted, and I said I'd provided guidance but all the work had been done by students. She said that was what she'd assumed, but she wanted to hear it directly. She asked if I'd be continuing with the robotics club, and I said I wasn't sure, that my presence seemed to create complications. Mr. Thornton asked me to meet with him and the school principal, a woman named Dr. Yolanda Hayes who'd been at Kennedy for 15 years. They sat me down in her office and explained that several parents had complained about having a military contractor working with students, and that the school board was concerned about liability issues. Dr. Hayes said she appreciated my contributions to the robotics team, but given the ongoing congressional investigation and media attention, she thought it would be best if I took a break from volunteering at the school. She emphasized this wasn't a judgment about my character, just a practical decision about managing risk and public perception. I said I understood and would stop attending robotics club meetings. Mr. Thornton looked uncomfortable with the decision, but didn't argue with the principal. I cleaned out my small locker in the robotics lab and left without saying goodbye to anyone, because I didn't trust myself to have that conversation without becoming emotional. The Congressional Committee released their report in February. The 300-page document detailed failures in the drone program's oversight, deployment decisions that ignored engineer warnings, and pressure from military leadership to rush systems into combat before they were ready. I was mentioned by name 17 times, usually in the context of technical specifications or timeline discussions. The report didn't assign criminal blame to individual engineers, instead focusing on systemic failures and institutional pressures. Several military officers and defense contractor executives were referred for further investigation, but the report acknowledged that most engineers had followed orders and raised concerns through appropriate channels. The media coverage focused on the highest-level officials rather than individual engineers like me, which was a relief. Andrea said the report essentially cleared me of criminal liability, while documenting that I'd been part of a flawed system. She said I could probably return to engineering work eventually, though defense contractors would likely avoid hiring me given the negative publicity. Derek Paulson was charged with 3 federal crimes related to theft of proprietary technology and misuse of classified information in a civilian context. His trial wouldn't happen for at least a year given the complexity of the technical evidence, but prosecutors were confident they had a strong case. Lincoln Prep's robotics team was banned from competition for 2 years, and Isabella Torres gave an interview saying she felt betrayed by an adult who was supposed to be mentoring them. She said the experience had taught her to question authority and verify that advice was ethical, not just effective. The competition committee revised their rules to require more stringent background checks for advisors and technical audits of robots that demonstrated unusual sophistication. Graham Foster credited my report with exposing a vulnerability in the competition system and preventing future misconduct. I spent the spring working construction jobs to pay rent while figuring out what to do next. My aunt was supportive, letting me stay in her spare room and encouraging me to consider teaching or consulting work that used my expertise without the ethical complications of military contracting. I started offering private tutoring in math and engineering to high school students, using online platforms that didn't require me to visit schools in person. The work was rewarding in a way defense engineering had never been, seeing students understand concepts and develop confidence in their abilities. One of my students was a sophomore from Kennedy High who asked if I was the engineer from the robotics scandal. I said yes, and she asked if I'd be willing to help her with a project. She wanted to build a robot for a different competition, one focused on humanitarian applications like water purification and disaster relief. She said she'd been inspired by the scandal to think about technology that helped people instead of competing for trophies or winning contracts. I agreed to advise her project, and we spent 6 months developing a solar-powered water filtration system that won a regional innovation award. In August, Sky contacted me through email saying she'd been elected captain of Kennedy's robotics team and wanted to rebuild the program with a focus on ethical engineering and community service. She asked if I'd be willing to return as an advisor under official oversight with full background disclosure and parent consent. She said Dr. Hayes had agreed to consider it if I was interested and if parents supported the decision. I met with Sky, Mr. Thornton, and Dr. Hayes to discuss what this might look like. We agreed I'd work with students on community-focused projects rather than competitive robotics, teaching engineering principles through real-world problem-solving. Parents would be informed of my background and could opt their children out of any projects I advised. The arrangement would be formally documented with the school district and subject to regular review. I agreed to these terms, and when Sky sent out the proposal to team families, 37 of 40 parents consented to my involvement. The new robotics program launched in September, focusing on projects that addressed local needs. Students designed assistive technology for disabled community members, built environmental monitoring systems for nearby parks, and created educational STEM kits for elementary schools. The work was more meaningful than competition had ever been, and students learned engineering in the context of serving others, rather than just winning awards. I taught them about ethical considerations in design, how technology choices affected people's lives, and why engineers had responsibilities beyond just making things work. Some students were initially disappointed we weren't competing, but most came to appreciate that solving real problems was more satisfying than accumulating trophies. In November, a journalist from a technology magazine interviewed me about the drone program scandal and what I'd learned from the experience. I talked about the pressure engineers face when working on military systems, the difficulty of speaking up about concerns in hierarchical organizations, and the importance of considering ethical implications during design rather than after deployment. The article framed me as someone who'd made mistakes but was trying to do better, which felt more honest than being either vilified or celebrated. Several other engineers from the drone program contacted me after the article published, saying they'd had similar struggles with conscience and career, and that they appreciated someone speaking publicly about these tensions. We formed an informal support group, meeting online to discuss ethical engineering practices and how to handle working in morally complicated fields. Derek Paulson's trial happened in March, lasting 3 weeks and resulting in conviction on 2 of 3 charges. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison and ordered to pay restitution to Lockheed Martin for the stolen proprietary technology. His testimony revealed he'd been driven by ego and competition pressure, wanting to prove his brilliance by making Lincoln Prep unbeatable. He'd justified the theft by telling himself that using military technology for civilian education wasn't really harmful, but the court rejected this reasoning. Isabella Torres testified about how Derek's deception had affected her understanding of her own abilities, saying she'd never know if her engineering skills were actually strong or if she'd just been executing someone else's designs. The judge called Derek's conduct a betrayal of both his former employer and the students he was supposed to be mentoring. I testified at Derek's trial, explaining how I'd recognized the proprietary technology and why I'd filed the complaint despite the personal costs. Derek's attorney tried to argue that I'd also misused military knowledge by working with high school students, but the prosecutor established clear differences between teaching general engineering principles and implementing specific classified systems. The judge ruled that my recognition of Derek's violations didn't constitute my own misconduct, and that exposing illegal activity was protected whistleblowing. The trial generated some media coverage, but much less than the Congressional hearing, and I was able to return to Oregon without being swarmed by reporters. Kennedy's robotics team completed 6 community projects that first year, earning recognition from the school board for innovative service learning. Sky graduated and chose to study engineering at Oregon State University, saying the community-focused robotics work had shown her what engineering could be when it prioritized people over profit. Several other team members pursued STEM degrees, and Mr. Thornton said the program had never had such strong student engagement. I continued advising the team, expanding to work with 3 other local high schools that wanted to adopt similar community-focused approaches. The work didn't pay well compared to defense contracting, but I slept better knowing what I was building and who it was helping. 2 years after the Congressional hearing, Andrea called to say the final legal proceedings related to the drone program had concluded. Several high-level officials had been fined or forced to resign, oversight procedures had been reformed, and the targeting algorithms I'd worked on had been suspended pending redesign with stronger safeguards. She said I was officially clear of any liability and could work in defense engineering again if I wanted to. I thanked her but said I'd found different work that suited me better. She said she understood and was glad I'd landed on my feet despite everything. I think about those students at Kennedy who laughed when I joined the robotics club, having no clue I was an engineer who'd built military drones. Their assumption was understandable, even if it stung. But what bothers me more is how my own expertise became something to hide rather than share, how the technology I'd designed had made me someone people were right to be skeptical about. The robotics scandal exposed Derek's misconduct, but it also forced me to confront my own choices and their consequences. Building drones that killed people had seemed justified at the time, a way to protect soldiers and serve my country. But the civilian casualties and congressional investigations taught me that good intentions don't excuse bad outcomes, and that engineers have responsibilities beyond just following orders. The community robotics work isn't prestigious or lucrative, but it lets me use my skills for something clearly good. Students learn engineering while making their community better, and I get to teach them not just technical skills but ethical thinking about technology's impacts. That seems more valuable than anything I built at Lockheed Martin, even if it doesn't come with security clearances or congressional hearings. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd been honest about my background from the beginning, if I'd joined Kennedy's team as a declared expert instead of pretending to be a beginner. Maybe Jordan would have respected my knowledge instead of dismissing me. Maybe I could have helped them win competitions instead of watching them struggle. But hiding who I was felt necessary at the time, a way to protect myself while rebuilding after my career collapsed. The irony is that trying to stay hidden made everything worse. Filing that complaint about Derek destroyed my anonymity and forced me into a public congressional testimony that exposed all the things I'd been trying to escape. But it also gave me a chance to take responsibility publicly, to acknowledge mistakes and try to do better. That wouldn't have happened if I'd stayed safely anonymous, coaching high school robots while pretending my past didn't exist. So maybe the scandal was necessary, a painful way to move from hiding to healing, from running from consequences to facing them and figuring out what comes next. If you made it this far, I hope you understand why I did what I did, why I joined a high school robotics team while hiding military engineering expertise, why I filed a complaint that destroyed my anonymity and career prospects, why I testified before Congress about drone casualties and technology ethics. None of it was simple or heroic, just a series of choices trying to balance self-protection with moral responsibility. The students who laughed at me turned out to be more right than they knew, not because I was incompetent, but because someone with my history had no business pretending to be normal. I'm still figuring out what normal looks like after everything that happened, but teaching kids to build things that help people feels like a start. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.